Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's lecture, which is on consultants. So we'll be talking about the roles, proposals, and engagement of consultants within architectural practice. Now, the first thing I'd like to talk about today is that the Acumen website interface has actually changed. So before we get into the lecture, I'd just like to point this fact out to you. It still has the three main parts, practice, projects, and resources, but some of the content within it has actually changed. So when you go into it, all you need to do then is to click on practice, project, or resources down the bottom, and you will find most of the same information as you had before. Now, on to this week's lecture. So what we'll talk about really is three things today. We'll talk about consultants and the architectural project in relation to the stages of the architectural project. We will talk about the different types of consultants and their roles within the architectural project. And then finally, we'll talk a bit about the engagement of consultants. So I suppose the first question we should ask is, what is a consultant? Well, a consultant is a professional trained in a certain field or discipline who gives expert advice for a fee. So architects are considered as consultants because they undergo a specific training and registration procedures in order to be able to call themselves an architect, and therefore to call themselves a professional and an expert within their particular field. So, one thing that we should take into account for this lecture is that it is based on the architect as a lead consultant, but as we saw from last week's lecture on procurement, this role could be played by others. So, moving right along, let's start with what the core stages of an architectural project are, of course, according to architects. I've gotten through all of these stages from Acumen. You see the six basic stages there, which I'll now go through. So with the first one, with concept design, that really has two phases. Firstly, pre-design, which is the research and information gathering phase, and design, during which the architect explores and illustrates the design and cost options appropriate to the size of the project for the client to consider. So in terms of pre-design, what this often means is to go and find out what development application requirements pertain to the site, to find out what the existing building is like, if there is an existing building. This might include measuring up the building. It involves collecting site information, topographical information, services, existing conditions, streets, setbacks, and so on and so forth. Of course, the second thing is then to do a design based on the client's briefing. Now, the second one on the screen there is design development, which is really to develop an approved concept design and then produce enough documentation to explain it to the client. And at this stage, we would be engaging quite a few of these specialist consultants, providing a schedule of proposed finishes, reviewing the developed design against a budget, and coordinate and prepare an updated estimate of the cost of works. Essentially, what we're doing here is we are producing a set of drawings that describes quite accurately the internal layout and the external shape of the building, including the materials that are going to be used, as well as the size of the windows, and so on and so forth. What this means is that with this information, we can then go for development approval. We can apply for development approval if that indeed is required for our site. The next stage that we move on to is construction documentation. Now, design development provides all of the information for construction documentation, but construction documentation rearranges that in a form where it will be appropriate for a building contract. So in other words, drawings and specifications have to be prepared in a very thorough way, from which the builder will build the building from. These documents will also be used to call tenders and negotiate prices with builders before one is appointed, and also be used for the building approval process. The next stage is contractor selection, which is really how we go and actually get a contractor to select a list of possible builders for the project, and then to figure out a way by which we can procure their services. This might be running a tender where there are very strict rules in terms of documents and how you ask questions, when it needs to be in, and so on and so forth. A negotiated offer, which is really when one talks to one or more builders and gets an offer up for the client's consideration. So it's quite like a tender, except that it's not quite as strict as a tender. And then finally, once we have selected a builder, architects would do contract administration as part of their core services. So this process ensures that a construction contract is executed in accordance with the terms of the contract and the contract documents. And the contract administrator may be a representative of either the builder or the client, as we heard last week in the procurement lecture, or maybe a third party. Also, as we talked about last week, the architect may or may not be the contract administrator. So please refer back to last week's lecture to see how this works. Now, all of this stuff has come from Acumen. So if you go to the project part of Acumen and then click on Core Architectural Services, you will have a description of these 6 stages there. In terms of what we are doing, of course, what architects would like to do is actually to be firstly the consultant that is involved in all these stages, and therefore to be the lead consultant, if you like, but we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Now, in terms of types of consultants and their role, of course, we know that architects are architects, and we know what architects do from what you are studying, as well as the previous lectures this semester. But why do we need consultants generally? We need consultants generally because of the required skills, required for a particular project, and also the mandatory registration of certain consultants. So in other words, the mandatory registration means that unless one is registered, one cannot provide that kind of work. The consultants that need to be registered under their own particular disciplinary legislation are building certifiers who take us through the building approvals process and will issue us with a building permit or building approval. Structural engineers and geotechnical engineers, both of which who self-certify their own work. So in other words, they have to do their work and then certify that it is correct before the building certifier will accept it as being proper and correct. Civil engineers, which have the same kind of registration as structural and geotechnical engineers. Energy raters and assessors, who are the consultants that ensure that our designs conform to the requirements, the energy requirements, and these individuals or these consultants also need to be registered. And finally, land surveyors. Land surveyors are not so much registered as licensed. which is just another word for the name registration, really, licensing. And what land surveyors do is that they make sure that the boundaries of our properties are where they're supposed to be, and they will actually go and peg this out on the site. They also survey the site for topographical information, such as how steep all the site is, and so on and so forth. When the project starts, the land surveyor may be called upon to come out and lay out the building on the actual site itself. Now, for smaller, more straightforward projects like small extensions and small houses and what have you, architects, builders, and subcontractors may perform the role of some of these consultants. So, for example, if you build a building out of timber and select all of your members out of the Timber Framing Code AS 1680, then your building certifier may well accept that way of designing the structure rather than insisting on a structural engineer. If the boundaries have already been pegged up by someone else, or they're pretty clear, or they don't really matter that much in the project, then they may not, a land surveyor may not be required. And of course, energy raters and assessors quite often are architects. So for architects who are energy raters and assessors, they can perform those roles upon their own buildings. Pardon me. So these are the main consultants that we use, that architects use. Other consultants that architects might use, we can see on this list, and really they are required on certain types of architectural projects because of their expertise or their discipline is required by the building codes. So fire engineers are the ones that work out, that verify escape paths in complex buildings, as well as designing the firefighting systems for the buildings, the heat detectors, the smoke detectors, the sprinkler layouts, the fire hose reels, the hose, the firefighting risers, and so on and so forth. All specialist, expert skills that architects don't have. Acoustic engineers, the second one on the list, are people who will actually tune a building to treat sound in a certain way. So sound very much can be something that is tuned so that excess sound can be absorbed, such as in concert halls and the like, where you want to get rid of echoes. On the same note, they could be trying to amplify sound, such as in football grounds and the like, where you actually want to have that roar of the crowd and what have you. Traffic engineers are generally brought in to lay out street patterns around buildings and car parks and so on and so forth. So for those of you who are doing BED 3, traffic engineers would be the people who will be helping you with your car parking layouts and so on and so forth. But also they are called on where there are complex traffic requirements, such as airports, where you have to have divided traffic requirements and secure areas and so on and so forth. Industrial facilities would be other places where traffic engineers are needed. Landscape architects are essentially architects of the landscape. Not only do they help with selecting plants, but they also design the landscape according to what can I say? According to sympathetic or similar design ethos as the architecture itself. And again, they have specific skills which architects don't necessarily have. We all know about architectural imaging, including model makers. Quite often architects do these in-house, but more often than not nowadays, there are experts who do these kinds of things who can do it faster and cheaper and better than the architects in-house. Arborists are people who deal with plants, with trees, so they provide expert opinion as to whether trees are as to the health of trees, and also how one might maintain trees, cut off errant branches, and so on and so forth. Environmental consultants, of course, talk about all things to do with the environment, and I might leave that one now because we will be looking at that in the next part of the lecture. But economists are quite often called on as well as consultants, especially in architectural projects, which are developments, commercial developments, where property is going to be bought and sold, and land has to be bought and sold. Economists are quite often called on to help to see whether the project will stand up or not from an economic point of view. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is really talk a bit more about three of the consultants that Tony Trobe talked about in his talk from a few weeks ago, because these are really people that you would never expect to need, but quite often they are required. Their work, their expertise is required for development approvals. So we'll talk about ecological consultants who deal with flora and fauna assessments, those who deal with scenic amenity, and then civil engineers who deal with on-site sewage management. Each of these consultants produce information to complement the work of the architect, but are coordinated by the architect to ensure that you have a holistic outcome at the end of the day. So the first thing I'll talk about is the flora and fauna assessment that was produced for the house that Tony Trobe talked about. Now, this is really purely in response to planning or development requirements. In this case, they were required to demonstrate that certain flora or habitat for fauna would be protected or not damaged by the proposal. So really, when you apply for a development application, they will have a certain number of overlays, and these are the kinds of things that overlays cover. So really what they were trying to do here is really about habitat protection for a certain type of bird. So the first thing that one needs to do is to really delineate the scope of their study, which includes where the two proposed houses are going to go. And then what you can see from this map here is that they actually did field work where they spent quite a lot of time on site and went on to research the distribution of certain birds and trees by not only looking for the birds themselves, but also looking for the trees in which the birds lived, and therefore those trees would have to be protected. And also they were looking for evidence that the birds were actually on the site. So you see the green square in the middle there, that was actually where they found owl pellets or owl poo, which means that this was not a previous habitat but an existing and operating habitat for the powerful owl. And then essentially what is then done is that Tony's design for the two houses were overlaid upon the work that was done by these consultants to demonstrate that the habitat would not be damaged by the actual proposal itself. Now, so the powerful owl in this case was something that whose protection was written into the planning laws. And similarly, the other thing that was written in was they call scenic amenity. So what that was about was really to protect the way the site looked from the sea, from the road, from the surrounds, and this was really part of a broader overlay for that whole bit of coast, and particularly important for Tony's site because that was on a little promontory that stuck into the sea, and if he had done the wrong thing, then he wouldn't have been given development approval. So this firm, Ecological Australia, also provided a scenic amenity assessment to actually prove to the authorities that the scenic amenity would be preserved with this proposal. And if you remember Tony's talk, his design was really a two-story house, or two-story houses, which sat within the tree line, set below the tree line. So all was fine because it wasn't actually visible from anywhere around the site. You can see that if this was something like a 5 or 6 story building, then you would start to have issues with the council, and it would be very hard to argue that the scenic amenity would be preserved according to the rules laid out in the local planning scheme. Now, part of this site, of course, because it's a remote site, it's also it's a remote site and it's ecologically sensitive. So there are also development requirements as to how to deal with your waste or your sewage that comes off the site. What this means also is that the site is not connected to main sewage like you would find in urban areas, and any sewage that is produced by the site needs to be treated on site. So in this case, they got some civil engineers to come in and design the sewage treatment plant and as a way of managing the sewage. So again, what they needed to do here was to actually produce a design that described where the septic tanks are going to be, and where the septic tank overflows are going to be. Now, the overflows, of course, are the processed grey water once they've gone through the septic tank system. So what the council needed to know was that this overflow would be contained within the site and would actually not be damaging towards the flora and fauna of the site. So here you can see these mounds, these dispersion mounds that they have designed, which are in a remote part of the remote part of the site that you can see over here. And really that needs to then be assessed by the council to make sure that that is going to work. But with most engineers, they self-certify their work anyway. So in other words, they guarantee that what they're doing is going to work. Now, moving right along, let's move on to the the third part of the lecture, which is really the engagement of consultants. So I suppose in the context of last week's lecture, this would be asking how consultants are procured. So really what we have is 4 different kinds of consultants. Lead consultants, which we've already touched on earlier in the lecture. Architects often fulfill this role, but not always. Specialist consultants, which are consultants who contribute to parts of the project, but not the whole design. So you can think of engineers, structural engineers, as being specialist consultants because they design only the structure of the building, not the cladding, not the windows, not the insulation, and so on and so forth. And then we move on to secondary and sub-consultants. So secondary and sub-consultants are both specialist consultants who have been employed to do various parts on the project. The difference between the two is how they are procured. Secondary consultants are contracted to the client directly. So if you think back to last week's lecture, we've got a continuous line between the client and the consultant, which makes them a secondary consultant. But the communications goes through the lead consultant. And sub-consultants are contracted by the primary or lead consultant. So the difference is that secondary consultants have a contractual arrangement to provide services directly with the client, where sub-consultants are actually hired by the lead consultant or the architect. Now, how does one go about selecting consultants? Consultants can be selected by either the client or by the architect. Client selection really needs to be vetted by the architect, because the architect has to be sure that the consultant that's being proposed is appropriate for the project and is going to be someone that they can work with. So the architect will then be going to check their references and so on and so forth. Again, just because a client knows an engineer doesn't mean that that particular engineer is the correct person for a particular job, because it really depends on the type and the scale of the job. Now, for larger jobs, quite often you can have open proposals that are called for. And then the proposals, when they come in, need to be evaluated by the architect or the client, or by somebody who actually has the requisite evaluation skills. The alternatives to this are to negotiate with one consultant. Really, in these cases, it could be someone that the client or the architect knows. In terms of the architect, they generally like to work with the same consultants, because they know what their performance is like, the communications are like. They know they can get work done in a certain amount of time. They know how they are to deal with, and so on and so forth. Now, the other alternative is to have a limited call for proposals, so to put it out to a few consultants that are deemed acceptable, and then to assess their proposals, and also to, if it is a client who is a corporation who procures a lot of consultancy work, then they might have a pre-registration process for consultants, which they can draw on for specific projects. Now, the engagement of consultants is based on risk, or minimizing the architect's exposure. But on the other hand, quite often architects will offer one fee for a team of consultants. So what that means is that for architects, it's better if the client engages the consultants rather than the architect. But in some projects, the clients may not want to engage all of the consultants, and will ask the architect to put a team together, and for the client just to pay the architect, and the architect will deal with the payment for the other consultants. The advantages of this is that it's good for inexperienced clients, because they just have to pay one fee. Architects get to lead, which is fine. Problems with consultants are resolved without the client, and consultants have confidence in the professional approach to the scope and definition of their roles and responsibility. So this is the building of an ongoing relationship and familiarity, and so on and so forth with each other's systems and what have you. The disadvantages of the one-stop shop, if you like, is that liability has to be shared between all of the consultants, and rather than just one consultant. So you can see that if one consultant is directly contracted to the client and does something wrong, then that one consultant has the liability because they're directly contracted with the client. But if one consultant within a group, a conglomerate that enters into a contract with the client screws up, then everybody in that conglomerate then becomes responsible. In terms of fees, the architects then become responsible for the consultant's fees, and really the professional indemnity insurance checking becomes the architect's responsibility. So what this means at the end of the day is there's additional administrative costs which are borne by the architect if they use this kind of system. So finally, what we'll do is we will look at what some fee proposals look like, and then what a client and architect agreement looks like. So what these two things are about is really how consultants propose services to clients, and once those proposals have been accepted, the kinds of agreements or contracts they actually enter into with each other. Now, this slide is about a fee proposal where the architect is not well known to the client, generally for bigger projects. So that's where previous experience and key personnel comes into play. The client may need to be told what those things are because they're not familiar with the actual architect themselves. Quite often it's where there are tenders for architectural services advertised in the press, and the architects are responding to those advertisements. So this is really the most complete way to do a fee proposal. You need to list down your previous experience, which demonstrates the suitability of your practice with similar projects. For example, practices who employ enough qualified staff would be more suitable to take on complex, large projects and deliver the work within a reasonable time frame, rather than firms that have smaller numbers of people working there. Key personnel. Now, this is a demonstration that the main people working on the project have the experience and particular skills to be able to do the work. So if you have architects who only have experience in domestic renovations, they might not be the best architect to lead teams designing multi-story buildings. The project team, what the project team is the other consultants who are not inside the architect's firm who will be required to work on the project. So engineers, building certifiers, land surveyors, all those people that we spoke about a few slides back. Availability refers to the capacity of the office to take on the project, including when it can start. So if a practice has a lot on, it might not be able to start immediately, and progress might be dependent on other projects in the office. So it is ethical to be letting your prospective clients know when you can get onto it and how fast you can go, essentially, which also includes when how long it's going to take, or other things being equal. There may, of course, be things that are outside the architect's control, and of course this needs to be adjusted, and the availability or the time frame needs to be adjusted with this. Project understanding demonstrates that the practice understands a preliminary briefing and has an appropriate approach to design the project. This includes familiarity with particular building types and programmatic functions, but also an understanding as to how much the proposed client wants the architect to do, so in terms of the scope. So if we go back to our list of core services from before, It may be that a certain client does not want the architect to do contract administration. Yeah, it may be that the client only wants the architect to go up to the stage where the development approval is issued. Um, this all needs to be made clear in fee proposals. Um, Responsiveness is the time frame in which practices respond to communications. So this seems like a very simple thing, but often it is a very important thing to know how long one should wait before one needs to start nagging someone else. So in other words, people may not respond immediately, but it does not mean that they're not going to respond. Yeah. So all these kinds of things. A good fee proposal actually talks about all these kinds of things. And then finally, the proposed fees, which includes a breakdown of the stages proposing, as well as the inclusions and exclusions. Again, the things that we talked about from the core architectural services. Now, this is an example of what one of these fee proposals look like. This is a kind of this is a pro forma, if you like, for a house from Ben Walker Architects. Ben actually teaches design at our faculty, although he's not doing so this year at the moment. Now, because it may be a bit difficult for you to see what's on the screen right now, I've actually also loaded this as a PDF onto our Canvas site. So this is for a domestic project, so it's quite a different situation. You will see that they are not really talking about previous experience or key personnel, and it's likely that Ben's reputation would have preceded him, and that the client would have approached Ben directly after getting a recommendation from someone else or seeing Ben's work in the architectural press. In other words, a client would go to Ben because they know what their work is like, what their expertise is, and they know that Ben will be working on it. But we do see here the understanding of the project through the project brief and the accommodation schedule, and the fees for the project, which is things that were listed as things that should be in fee proposals in the previous slide. And then here we see the third and the fourth page where we where we see the project team, which is what he's got under 4 there as sub-consultants. So he's actually saying that structural engineer, energy assessor, surveyor, hydraulic engineer, and a cost planner are people that might be needed for the project. So he's letting the client know that there's going to be other people that need to be involved in the project. Finally, down the bottom, you can see the costs and works not included and the additional work outside the scope of services, points 5 and 6, which is really making it very clear what he's going to include and what he won't. And then in terms of the program, point number 7 over there, if we go back, if we look at the slide if we go back to the slide 2 slides ago, what he's talking about there is really the availability. So he's telling them when he can actually start and when he can come up with the first round of drawings for the clients. And then finally, point 8 there, he's actually saying how regularly he will bill for the project once he's appointed. Now, once the architect is appointed or the consultant is appointed by the client, then they start having a relationship essentially. Now, this involves accepting the fee proposal, from which an agreement or a contract needs to be entered into between the client and the consultant. So what I'll do is to use the example of the standard AIA, Client Architect Agreement, as an example of how this works. So this is the 2009 Client Architect Agreement. This one is actually for smaller projects, so it's relatively short, just a few pages. But these things can be very involved for very large projects. Yeah, so I think it's probably good for us to start with the smaller one. What I will do is load a PDF on this onto the Canvas site as well, so that you can actually have a closer look at it in case you can't see what's on the screen right now. So you have all the basic things that you need in the contract. You have the signatories to the contract, being the consultant and the client, but also a short description of the project, which should include the address, and the budget, the agreed initial budget. Okay, so all these things are written down so that it's all clear and known and everybody's on the same page. On the right, you can see the standard contents of such a contract such as this, and also the defined terms which are all being agreed on. Now, what happens also is that on each page, as you can see down the bottom, apart from the front page which has the signatures, on each page down the bottom, the architect and the client will initial the pages after they've been filled in, just so that again everybody agrees to what's written down there. This is probably the most important page in the agreement, because it goes through some key things, such as the services that are provided, as you can see there in Schedule A. The other services, the other architectural services that are provided. So those are the extras. And then in Schedule E1, you have the fees and the fee stages as agreed. These may take the form of a percentage of the budget, or a lump sum, regardless of what the budget may become, or an hourly rate based on how much time that the architect spends on it. So you can mix and match these kinds of things. You can have a lump sum for one of the core services, and an hourly rate for another, and then a percentage for a third. So there's no reason why you need to have it all the same, but it is something that needs to be agreed upon. The percentage fee is probably the fairest way, because then it is entirely dependent upon how much is being spent on the project. So if the budget goes up through decisions not of the architect, then obviously the amount of work that is needed to execute the project, the drawings, to prepare the drawings and the design, what have you, will also go up. Therefore, a percentage is probably the fairest way of doing it. The lump sum fee system puts the architect at a bit of a disadvantage if the complexity or the scope of the project goes up, because what the architect will then need to do is to renegotiate the fee based if the scope actually goes up. The hourly rate is probably one that disadvantages the client, because there is no end to how much the client will be paying. It's all depending on how much the architect wants to actually spend on it. Now, Schedule E3 on the next page, what that is that is about disbursements. So disbursements are really incidental costs that happen during the preparation of the drawings and the design. And the disbursements, this section is really about who pays the disbursements and how. So you see on the top there's 3 ways of doing that. One of which being that the client pays. The second one being that the architect pays and then is reimbursed for the amount that has been paid. And finally, that the architect pays and then charges the client a service fee for handling the payment of this. Okay, so when the client pays, it just means that the architect passes the invoice for whatever incidental is needed. It could be printing drawings, it could be airfares, and so on and so forth. It could be rental special equipment, and the client will pay it directly. Now, Schedule F, you can see there that there is a list of specialist consultants, and you can see there also that it does say there the options there are for the client to engage or for the architect to engage. So really, this goes back to what we were talking about in terms of sub-consultants or sub-consultants, or what am I looking for here? Secondary consultants. So secondary consultants being engaged by the client and sub-consultants being engaged by the architect. Okay, so thanks everybody for your attention. I will be available if you want to ask questions at uni. Otherwise, you can always ask me questions about this lecture after next week's lecture on Wednesday. Thanks.